So we have got Tim Wilson, my colleague, my trade union friend, a scientist. All kind of things are there linked with Tim Wilson. So warm welcome for my podcast, Tim.
Thank you.
How's the day today so far? It's been a nice weather.
Yeah, it's actually it's been a bit of a different day because we had this dramatically over frosted freezer in the laboratory. The door had been left ajar and all this ice had frozen between the door and the freezer. So much of the day was spent in archaeologically excavating the depths of that freezer and getting sort of stuff out that was, sort of recognized, oh, that's 10 years ago sort of stuff, and defrosting that. And then I went into town. My oldest boy is moving to Edinburgh to do physics in September, starting university. And he had a desperate need for some new clothes and things, which he perfectly capable of getting himself. But he also wanted to get some walking boots, and I went with him for that to give him some advice on good boots. So a very different day from the average one, and yeah, it's lovely weather, so I can't complain. Yeah. It's almost summer, in fact.
I think the UK summer, Scotland summer. I mean, it's brilliant.
No, it's rubbish. I haven't had a decent summer for 30 years. 25.
So the first obligatory question is like, where were you born and raised?
Yeah, Melbourne in Australia. And there we have proper summers, absolutely, where it can get to 35, 40 degrees and it's properly hot and the sky is a deep dark blue because it's so dry. That's a proper summer. Dundee doesn't have summer, it just sort of has. I mean, here I'll ring my family at this time of year and say, oh, it's a nice day today, it's 19 degrees, and they'll say, yeah, it's the depths of winter here, it's about 19 degrees. Very different climate.
Yeah, because I was in Australia a couple of years to do my postgrad in National University.
Right.
That's in Canberra. So my first day was, I mean, because I just flew from Bangladesh, and the different time zone, and then so I just fell asleep because it was a long journey. And when I woke up, and then I said, my God, is it like morning? And then I found that it's still like 11. So I went there in I think close to December, like mid-December. And I think it was 11 p.m. and then it's still full sun.
It's not quite that bad. It must have been more 9 p.m. I think than 11.
Could be, yeah.
But you were jet lagged, so that's okay.
But one thing, I mean, the thing you just mentioned, the deep blue sky. I mean, I never saw that kind of blue sky, never ever in my life. So
yeah.
So I
guess in Bangladesh it'll be too humid, too much moisture in the air.
Yeah.
So that makes the sky a light blue if it's not full of clouds. Yeah.
So looking back, I mean, so you were raised in Melbourne. So it's you were a city boy, basically.
Yeah. Grew up in the suburbs. Very comfortable existence. What's still one of the world's livable cities.
Yeah.
It's very big now, but it's still got lots of open space. There are worse cities to grow up in for sure.
Yeah. Another kind of my kind of question then, looking back, how do you find your parents, influenced you in terms of your understanding about the world?
Yeah, it's a good question, that one. Obviously they have an influence. And they're both Well, my dad died many years ago when I was 18. But, you know, looking back on my childhood, they're good middle-class bourgeoisie, you know, very respectable, you know, but concerned about people in the world. But for whatever reason, my politics has definitely ended up being a little to the left of theirs. But, you know, they gave me a good role model about how to live and how to interact with the community. They both, in their different ways, were involved in the community in voluntary roles and various things. Like my father was a scout leader.
Wow.
And my mum did you know, she was a kindergarten teacher until she had twins, of which I'm one. That was pretty much a full-time role. But, you know, once we got up a bit, she got back into doing a lot of voluntary work, working for one of the big hospitals in Melbourne, for instance, doing voluntary work there. Things so, you know, they both were involved in the community and clearly cared about other people, and I think that's rubbed off on me to some extent, at least.
Good. So, like, I mean, it's like, you know, like a scout leader is like different from, like, you know, growing up in a like army family. So do you think there are lots of discipline in the like household? You have to follow certain, you know.
No, we didn't have an awful lot of discipline in my household. I mean, there were boundaries, sure, but certainly nothing like an army. No, much more freedom than that.
Good.
And, you know, we had a freedom that you just don't have these days as kids. You know, my parents bought a house in a new suburb, which meant there were lots of young families close by. So, you know, we grew up in a little court with 5 houses in it. And between those 5 houses, there were 5 kids exactly my age, all going off to primary school together. And we had a lot more freedom to just roam around the suburbs than kids are given these days. You know. So.
Because, I mean, the way I kind of, you know, we take care of our kids. I've got 2 young kids as well. And there's lots of micromanagement, isn't it? We are like afraid of things. I don't know what things.
It's always hard to strike that balance, isn't it? I mean, you know, you got to encourage them to spread their wings and things, but you got to protect them also. And who knows whether I've got the balance right? You know, we tried to push them up trees and things like that rather than running out and saying, "Oh, don't, you might fall," you know, etc. But yeah, at some point you've got to hold onto the hand and say, "No, that's far enough." You know, so I don't know whether we've got the balance right, but I hope we've done okay, and hope we've done okay setting a role model also with my own activities.
Like, I mean, one of the story in my current life is I've got a small garden in the back garden, and in the summer it's nice. You can sit down there outside. But also in the summer you get lots of bees and the bugs, you know, good bugs. But the way my kids behaved, you know, when they face bees or, like, you know, it's just like, I mean, that really annoys me because, you know, when we are growing up, no, we're not afraid of these things. I mean,
yeah, I mean, maybe that's just an individual personality. I haven't noticed my kids being afraid of insects. I remember one very funny occasion when my oldest boy, Martin, couldn't have been more than about 5. And we were having lunch outside, and this we sort of walked away from this table, and this little dormouse appeared on the table and started nibbling at a piece of bread, and he couldn't cope with that at all.
oh my God.
He just sort of went into shock. But yeah, both boys do have some appreciation of the natural world, I feel. You know, they like to see the birds in the garden, and just a couple of days ago we had a little fox visit the garden, and
Wow.
Yeah, something like that's always nice.
Like going back to like Melbourne, so then you went to like public school. I mean, tell us about your school a bit. I mean, any particular tip?
Well, I went to the local primary school, and the teacher I remember most there was my fourth grade teacher, who drove a hotted up Mini Minor, and was a young guy with a big afro haircut. He was a really cool guy. And he gave me an aphorism that I've remembered to this day, which was he told the class, not just me, it was that 35 is the age at which the breadth of your mind and your waistline swap over. So I'm well past that. I'm trying to keep slim, and I'm trying to keep broad-minded.
So I mean,
he was a really cool teacher.
Yeah, he did good thing for you.
Absolutely, but you know, I had a good relationship with all my teachers. You know, that's just the way it was. And then I won a scholarship to one of the fancy private schools in Melbourne. And so my high school experience was quite different. I had, you know, a decent commute to get to the school on public transport. And it was a school that was, you know, privileged in many ways. And yeah, so I benefited from a great education there. And I remember a number of the teachers there, but I haven't got any great stories right off there I could tell you. But one of the things I really enjoyed at that school was they had a camp just outside Melbourne in the bush, which we got to go to each year. And there you did things like walking and canoeing and things like that. And I took the opportunity late in my time to be a leader there as well, because you know, I've always enjoyed getting out into the natural world. And yeah, I had some great fun up there. I was sort of, I remember some of the really tough kids in the school getting scared witless by, you know, seeing a snake and things like that, which was always a good laugh. Because there's a lot of snakes outside Melbourne, believe me. and they're all deadly, so you don't need to worry.
Australia is famous for all those sea beaches. I mean, which ones are better? Sydney one, like Bondi, or
Well, there's no competition. Sydney's got much better beaches than Melbourne, because Sydney has surf beaches. You know, they have proper waves that you can surf at and swim in and everything, whereas Melbourne's on a large bay. And so while it's got nice beaches, the water's flat and boring. You got to go well south of Melbourne to get to the surf coast, where out beyond the bay. And my family used to have summer holidays down there on the surf coast. And I've always loved the surf. Because my father was also a surf lifesaver. He knew how to swim extremely well in the surf, and he taught me how to swim in the surf. I'm not as strong a swimmer as him, but I still learned it. And yeah, so it was always great fun going down in the surf. And that's one of the things I really miss living in Dundee, because frankly, the waves aren't big enough and the water's far too cold.
We have some beautiful beaches, but no, the water is a different story.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, Scotland, not so much on the east coast, but you know, over on the west coast, there's just gorgeous beaches.
Gorgeous.
you know, if it was 10 degrees warmer, they'd sell for £1 million a metre. But it's probably a good thing that they're cold, because they're essentially unspoiled.
Yeah, that's true. That's
so
true.
You can really, so Nicole's just been up to the far north, hasn't she? And posted a few pictures of just they're beautiful beaches up there.
Beautiful, yeah.
It's good as anyway.
I mean, like, one of my best memory when I was in Australia, so when I went to Sydney, one of the places I went is called La Perouse. So like that's the place where James Cook stepped in first. It was so beautiful. So, I mean, it's I don't know, it's like something very special. So whenever I try to do any kind of meditation, I try to visualize La Perouse. There's still in my
there's beautiful coastline all around Sydney, because it's got all these little coves and beaches and things. That's beautiful. But now La Perouse was actually a French sea captain. You see, the British got to Australia first before the French, but not by much. And it wasn't long after the first fleet arrived and the first white settlers arrived. It's only a matter of months or something before a number of French ships turned up. And so, there wasn't that much in it. A matter of a few months, and Australia might have been a French colony instead of a British colony. Whether that would have been better or worse, I'll leave others to decide. So there's quite a few place names around the southern and eastern coast that are sort of recognize that commemorate the French arrival in Australia.
Like going back, so like we try to catch up things to your earliest memories. So you are a science guy now. So like, I mean, where it started, like what point you thought that, oh my God, I want to be a scientist. I'll deal with DNA or human genome thing and all those things.
Right.
What was the moment?
There wasn't one. Somewhere along the line in my latter part of high school, I decided I wanted to do science. But I had a lot of trouble tossing over what would be my actual major as an undergraduate in science, etc. Chemistry was my favorite subject in high school. And so I thought I was likely to do chemistry. But I also enrolled in biochemistry, and I ended up majoring in biochemistry. And the main reason for that was that I thoroughly enjoyed learning chemistry, but all the practicals, I always came out with a headache from all these noxious chemicals and things. And I thought, I want to live a nice long life. I don't want holes in the brain when I'm 40. So I decided I would go for a less pungent career, shall we say, and ended up majoring in biochemistry. And back in the 80s when I was doing this, molecular biology was the hot new subject, and I sort of enjoyed learning it, and sort of that's what I ended up doing my PhD on. And the exact topics I've been doing since have sort of drifted from time to time, or jumped, but that's the way it goes in any career, I'm sure. So, I majored in biochemistry and enjoyed the molecular biology, and that got me into the DNA stuff. It's a long time since I've done anything really on DNA. These days I work on RNA, which I might have to explain in a little while. But yeah, I got into the biochemistry, and some of the techniques I used were more biophysical, and that took me to a postdoc in New Hampshire in the States. doing quite different work there. And then eventually I ended up here in Dundee.
So it's a kind of, I don't know, like, I mean, can you draw a kind of triangle, you know, from Melbourne to like New Hampshire and then Dundee?
Well, you can geographically. I'm not sure it makes sense from the point of view of my career. Definitely got a few more squiggles in it, straight lines. But yeah, it's certainly been, you know, an interesting experience moving from Australia and then living for 3.5 years in the States and then coming to Scotland. You know, you keep an open mind about places and you look for the good and bad in them. No place is perfect, as I'm sure you can spend many hours extolling the problems living in Canberra, for instance, as well as the good points. No, that's just the way it goes. But yeah, I really enjoyed living in the States for 3.5 years.
Because I mean, that's quite a posh part of USA, New Hampshire.
Well, not really. It's just north of Massachusetts and Boston. It's only an hour's drive. Where I lived was only an hour's drive to Boston, and Boston is definitely, you know, posh with Harvard, et cetera, et cetera. And New Hampshire has very well-to-do parts of, absolutely. The university in New Hampshire where I worked is sort of on the final, most inland section of a large inland waterway. And you want to own a house anywhere on that complex waterway, you got to have big pockets, very deep pockets. But New Hampshire is a very weird state. Its state motto is "Live free or die." That's what you see on their number plates: "Live free or die," and that comes through very much in their politics. So what it means is they have the lowest tax in the US. Which means they have the worst services in the US for things like state education and state health.
Public transport.
And exactly. And so they have areas of extreme poverty. You go into the backwoods and, it's frightening. But the flip side of that is they don't believe that anyone's got the right to tell you what you should believe and what you should do. So it was also the first state in the country to appoint a gay bishop. You know, it's not Trumpian republicanism, extremism. It is sort of on the economic side, but it's quite a liberal state on the social side, because it will, it basically says, well, I mightn't approve of a gay bishop, but I don't have the right to tell you can't appoint one. And so, the congregation did. They chose their bishop, and that's the way it goes in New Hampshire. So my boss in New Hampshire, before I came, basically described the university as an island of liberals in a sea of rednecks, and he really wasn't too far wrong, I can tell you.
No, that's fascinating story. I mean, it's like
it's a strange place.
Because normally, free market economy normally work with like socially conservative, kind of ideas, like this like Thatcherite, Reaganite kind of thing. But New Hampshire seems very, very kind of, it's almost like kind of California, like Berkeley University, very liberal.
Well, but it's different because it's got this weird mix of fiscal conservatism and at least large sections of the community are socially liberal. But there's certainly socially conservative parts too. And being one of the most white states in the US, it's not difficult to find overt racism in New Hampshire either. My landlord, for instance, was out and out racist, but what can you do?
So, like, I mean, just going back to a bit, like your undergrad, which university did you go for your undergrad?
At the University of Melbourne.
Melbourne, okay.
And I went on and did my PhD there as well.
Yeah. Like, how long did you stay in America, in like New Hampshire?
3.5 years. I arrived at the end of September, just as the fall colours were in full bloom. And the fall colours in New England are just stunning. I had, at the time, I had a friend from Melbourne who had been living in a year ahead of me in Boston. He left after a year back to Melbourne, but he met me when I first arrived and said, right, despite the fact that I was jet lagged, he dragged me up into the White Mountains to see the fall colours for the next day. And it just blew my mind. There's this magnificent fall, extraordinary. And then I went into what at the time, I don't know whether it still is, but at the time it was the snowiest winter on record in New Hampshire. Because we had snow on the ground for 3 months a year. And it just seemed to snow every second day that first winter. And all the locals were grumbling, oh, I wish this snow had stopped, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going, oh, this is brilliant. I've never been anywhere like this. This is fantastic. Having an absolute ball.
Oh my God. So you did some like surfing. So did you start like some kind of skiing there as well when you moved to America?
I learned skiing in Australia.
Okay.
I mean, Canberra's just north of the Snowy Mountains.
Yeah.
There is skiable snow in Australia, and I learned to ski in my teenage years in Australia. But yes, you could step out the door on cross-country skis in winter where I lived. And I did that from time to time. And it was only about an hour's drive to the closest ski resorts in the White Mountains. So I had a few trips up there with friends from work. Yeah.
Good.
But I was extraordinarily lucky in New Hampshire. Shortly after I arrived, and I was looking around for a place to stay, and I'm getting rather depressed at all these dumps that I was looking at that I could afford. A guy from the department came along and introduced himself and said, maybe you'd like to have a look at the place that's available next to me. And so I said, sure. And he took me out. It was about 7 miles from the university, essentially in the bush. We went off onto a private road and eventually down a little hill. And what was on offer was a cottage from the 1920s.
Oh my God.
A wooden cottage from the 1920s. That was beside a lake.
Wow.
And by beside a lake, I mean it was less than 1 meter from the lake on 3 sides.
Oh my God.
And so as soon as I saw it, I just said to myself, you'd be mad not to take this. I did. It was a little more than I was hoping to pay, but oh, what the heck. So yeah, I had this lake, and I could swim in it in the summer, and I could ski on it or skate on it in winter.
Oh my God. Yeah. Did you do any fishing there as well?
Lots of people did, but I didn't. No, I'm not a fisherman.
Okay.
It amazed me, it would freeze in winter. The ice would be, 60 centimeters thick. The locals told me, oh, you could drive a truck on this. and there'd be people who'd go out there and bore a hole through the ice and sit above it, ice fishing, in the middle of winter. And sometimes they'd drag a little cabin and they'd sit in the cabin and and I thought to myself, it's freezing cold, it's minus 10 degrees. And they're ice fishing, and I'm thinking to myself, gee, their home life must be good if this is the attractive alternative.
Just like in terms of the timing, like what year you were in New Hampshire?
I was in New Hampshire from 95 to 99.
So that's like Bill Clinton in power, isn't it?
Yes. Before the arrival of George Bush.
But also you had to go through all those, like Monica Lewinsky thing and all those things going on 24/7 on the news.
The whole thing's just, American media is just so terrible, and it's just appalling. It explains an awful lot about the way Americans behave. Because the media essentially ignores the rest of the world. Unless an American's got killed, it's not news, the rest of the world, unfortunately. I can remember, I think in 3.5 years, there were 3 stories from Australia that made the local media. And they all involved death and destruction in one way or another. Probably not American, so it was unusual.
I teach politics. I think that Bill Clinton, the way we see him, like kind of normal guy, did lots of good stuff. But I think in terms of foreign policy, he's quite sinister. In terms of, even if you look at Iraq war, the subsequent war, he did actually groundwork in 1998 when he passed this, Iraq Liberation Act. But if you see that the bad faith politics, he was actually, totally tangled with this Monica Lewinsky case, and he was trying to distract the people to something else. And he started bombing Iraq. It just so bad faith politics. So that's American.
It's just standard issue, isn't it? American politics.
Yeah. So you come back to UK. You came.
So and then I moved here in 99.
99. So that's like Tony Blair here.
Yeah.
So I'm just like trying to catch up with that, the political figures as well. So my time in Australia, what's his name? John Howard, isn't it?
John Howard, yeah.
Howard, yeah.
Yeah. So you were in Australia when? In the late 90s or early?
Yeah, 2000. Yeah.
Because you see, I used to joke to my friends when I was in 95. I joked to my friends that I was leaving to be an exile to avoid observing John Howard become Prime Minister and Carlton to win the football premiership. Unfortunately, both of them came true.
Because
John Howard was an absolute disaster as a Prime Minister. He was just shocking.
Quite funny, like the way Australian politics work. So they call, basically, this is a Tory party, but they call it Liberal Party.
Liberal Party. It's a different use of the word, isn't it?
So there is nothing to see here in terms of liberal thing.
Well, if you go back 50 odd years, the party was almost it was at least closer to appropriately named. Yes, it was still a party of privilege.
Yep.
But it still had this sort of residual idea of noblesse oblige. and Australia in general had a more egalitarian society back then than it does now. And so the old guard of the Liberal Party, around the time that John Howard came to power, were absolutely mortified by the policies that Howard and co were bringing in, which were much more the neoliberal policies we're all too familiar with here, unfortunately.
Yep.
You know, so the so-called Liberal Party in Australia has definitely drifted significantly to the right. You know, so yeah, like I said, back sort of in the 50s, it was certainly very a patrician idea, but it was much closer to the political centre than it is now. And there really wasn't a truly right-wing party in Australia back then. Though I would definitely describe the current incarnation of the Liberal Party as a truly right-wing
politics,
and totally disgraceful. It's just, yeah, don't get me started, please. We'll be here all night.
So like coming back to Dundee, okay, so you are now in Dundee. So we are, if you talk about your timeline, what was your first day in Dundee? How was it?
Oh gosh, I can't even remember. I really can't. It was just a normal day.
Like from like New Hampshire to Dundee.
Yeah, it's just. I'm not sure. I can't remember. I don't think I actually flew New Hampshire to Dundee.
Okay.
I think I had a brief trip home first.
Okay.
And then flew. I've done so many trips home from here over the years. It's all a bit of a blur, I'm afraid. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing special moving from New Hampshire to Dundee. Okay, the architecture's a bit different. The climate's a little different, but you know, the change from Australia to the Northern Hemisphere is a much, much greater change. As you would know, you know, the first thing that struck me when I stepped off a plane in Europe, because I first came here as just a backpacker when I was 21, you know, the trees don't have any leaves. I'm not stupid. I knew that landing in April, you know, that it was early. Landing at the beginning of April, it was early spring. You would expect to see bare trees, but you just don't see that in Melbourne. Even the deciduous trees that are imported from Europe, they really struggle to lose their leaves in winter. Because it's just not cold enough. So, you know, you got this immediate hammer blow of just everything is different. And, you know, you look out at night, the moon's upside down. It's the right way up in Australia. It's upside down up here. You know, there's all these, you know, the shock in moving from Australia to the Northern Hemisphere is because, and I've often reflected on that from the point of view of Europeans moving to Australia and, you know, 200 years ago. Yeah, it must have been so disorientating because every plant is different. The place smells different, you know. They must have been so dislocated and, frankly, scared.
I mean, I think that was the whole point, isn't it? Because it was a punishment, not like, you know, it's a kind of.
Yes, it was. Yeah, it was certainly, you know, a way of getting rid of the ne'er-do-wells, etc. But, you know, a lot of that is also, from a modern perspective, you know, what they were punished for was, you know, trivial.
So minuscule and just.
Yeah. I mean, the real criminals all got hung.
Oh yeah, I mean it was the
economic criminals who, you know, stole a loaf of bread because they wanted to feed their family who got transported to Australia. I generalize a little bit, but to a large degree, that's true. And so, you know, these days, having a convict heritage is no shame at all in Australia.
No.
None at all. I don't have one myself, but, you know, it's my earliest ancestors that we know about, and certainly things are lost in the mist of time, but we know however many great grandmother and father on my mum's side came out to Victoria, settled in Portland, one of the very earliest settlements in the 1830s. And they were from Cornwall. And, you know, I used to think, oh, well, Cornwall's a great smuggling centre back then. And they were fishermen. And my mum's family had an anglicised French name. So, you know, we figured they were smuggling between Brittany and Cornwall, you know, etc. Nice romantic idea, but it turns out I had no idea whether some of the family was involved. But when Mum dug out those records, turned out that my immediate ancestors, they were 18 years old when they left Cornwall. They decided there was nothing for them there. They got married and got on the boat to Australia a couple of days later at 18. And so it was a romantic adventure for them, perhaps, but I don't think they were involved in smuggling. But they were part of the fishing community in Australia initially. That's how they started. So they weren't guests of Her Majesty. Or his Majesty, or whichever it was at the time.
No, I mean, it's quite funny because I know a colleague in business school, Bill Russell. He actually came to UK a couple of times through sea. I mean, so it took him, I think, 3-4 weeks from Australia to UK by boat.
No, surely not. It'd be longer than that.
I mean, I don't know, like it could be like, I mean, I thought that was too short period, but it should take, I thought it will take 3 months, but
yeah,
apparently it doesn't. It is much shorter now.
Well, perhaps if you go the quickest route and don't stop it, maybe it's a month. I don't know.
Could be, yeah.
My mum came to the UK from Australia by boat with a number of friends after finishing her teacher training, and that took about 12 weeks. She told me.
12 weeks, okay.
But they stopped at ports throughout Asia and had 2 days here and 2 days there, etc. But a month sounds like a pretty quick trip. I didn't know that you could do it these days. I guess you hitch a ride on a cargo ship or something.
So you are in Dundee. Did you think that, you know, you might end up in Dundee for a long haul, or did you were thinking something else, that no, I'll stay here for a couple of years and then I'll?
No, it's the usual story. I came for 3 years and got stuck. But coming to Dundee had its attractions to me, because my grandmother on my father's side, my granny, was born in Broughty Ferry.
My God, no.
And it turns out, we've learnt more recently, they were actually a very well-to-do family in Broughty Ferry.
Yeah, Broughty Ferry.
So my great-great-grandfather owned, I think it's the Wentworth Hotel or something out at. We went to see it with my cousin a couple of years ago. It's a ruddy great big mansion. It's huge. unfortunately, none of the wealth trickled down to us. I think there were too many third siblings and females in the line of inheritance to reach out to me. but yeah, they were well to do, and they sold that up and bought another rather palatial place out Kirrinmuir way.
Wow.
So anyway, I knew there was this local connection to the area, which sort of tickled my fancy a little bit. But the simple reason is I got stuck, got married, and suddenly getting home was not as easy as it would have been if I was single. You know, I married Cecile, she's French, and you know, so we were never going to satisfy the desire to live close to family, and you know, we basically decided that Dundee was a comfortable place to stay. So we have.
Good. So
my boys consider themselves Scottish.
Yeah, but you're also Scottish. You've got, you know, DNA from like
got a bit of DNA. That's right.
So you're a scientist. I mean, what it takes to become a scientist, like your kind of scientist?
That's a tough question.
Just like random question, you know, like.
Well, you know, I think any good scientist needs a good deal of curiosity. And, you know, you've got to have an interest in the world around you. You've got to be interested in solving problems. And you've got to be willing to embrace uncertainty. You know, in as much as doing research, there's no point doing research on the things you know.
Yeah.
You've got to do it on the things you don't know. And you're always, so you've got to be comfortable with that. One of the attributes a good scientist needs is you need to have the imagination to speculate, to have ideas, but you've also got to have the humility to reject those ideas when the evidence goes against you. And I've seen this on several occasions over my career where a scientist has had a considerable amount of trouble disposing of a pet theory when the evidence was clearly against it. You've got to be able to come up with hypotheses and ideas, but you've also got to be able to recognize when they're wrong. And I think so. There's a couple of things that you need as a scientist.
Does it mean like you have to work in a team? It's always a team there.
That is very much field dependent.
Okay.
And it's also, but I do think that there's a trend to be more and more team orientated over the course of history since the Industrial Revolution. You know, the idea of the lone scientist beavering away late at night and eureka, etc. It's not really true all that much these days. But there are fields which are still very much for the lone wolf, you know, like theoretical physics. You know, it relies on the imagination of usually a sole individual, and sure, other people might grab hold of an idea and flesh it out, but people tend to be working, you know, by themselves or in small teams. But most laboratory-based work is done in small teams, and even if you have your own project, you'll almost certainly be having regular, in our laboratory, it's usually weekly meetings where you discuss the results, and it's an opportunity to critique interpretations. But it's also an opportunity to, develop new ideas, work out, new approaches, etc. So you have the exchange of ideas in a small team, even if you are doing the work individually. Then at the other extreme, there's things like the Large Hadron Collider outside Geneva, where, they publish one paper every 5 years and it's got an author list the length of a phone book, because there are so many different components that go into making up the experiment, etc. And that's all very much massive teams. So it's definitely varies a lot from field to field, but I do think over time there's more and more working in teams, more and more relying on the skills of different people to reach a result. Anything like, there's all the IT stuff now, big data. I don't have the skills to do that. I'm sure I could acquire them if I wanted to, but to a large degree, it makes much more sense to just rely on someone else who's got the skills to do that analysis. Because, I think you do have to work as a team.
Tell us a bit, your work kind of, area. Do you have to wear those special thing every day?
Personal protective equipment, you mean, PPE?
PPE.
It's funny you should mention that. The requirement to wear it has actually eased off recently. Because there's been a shortage of laboratory gloves in the last year and a half. Yeah, no, seriously, because there's been a real shortage. So with the arrival of the pandemic, laboratory gloves became very hard to acquire. And so whereas the health and safety guys would have had a pink fit if they saw you walking around the laboratory without wearing gloves, now we've been given considerably more discretion on whether to wear gloves or not, which in my opinion is a very good thing anyway, because most of the time when I'm wearing gloves, I'm wearing them to protect my experiment from my filthy hands and all the different biological things that can fall off me into the experiment. There are times where I handle, concentrated acids, which I really don't want to spill over me, and things like that. Or I'm working with radioactivity and I want some shielding, and really the thing I really need is shielding of the eyes. That's the most vulnerable thing. So there are times when PPE is a good idea and is necessary. But for most of the work I'm doing, it's not actually necessary, because at least in the field I work in, we're often handling much less than 1 mil in terms of a volume, and putting it into a little tube. There's no physical danger and it's basically water with a few biological materials in it. There's no physical danger to me if I happen to spill it.
Okay.
So whereas there is danger to my experiment if I sneeze into that tube, that's the sort of thing you can wipe out a week's work if you manage to get some nucleases in your experiment. So, you do take care, but mostly it's to protect your work rather than yourself. But that sort of judgment also is something that would come with experience. You wouldn't want someone who's in the lab for the first time to just, don't worry about your safety gear. She'll be right, mate, sort of attitude. You don't want that. But for someone who's been working in the environment for me, with people who've got experience, I think on the whole, they can make sensible judgments.
So,
you do occasionally hear frightful stories of people who made a misjudgment, which is well worth thinking about too occasionally.
So just like, I mean, for the layman like me, I mean, can you walk us through a bit, you know? So I know you are working on something called nucleic acid, isn't it?
Yeah, right. So what I've been working on here in Dundee in various manifestations is RNA, ribonucleic acid. Now, everyone's heard of DNA.
Yeah.
Which is deoxyribonucleic acid. This is the famous genetic material. And the difference between RNA and DNA is in the name. Deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. It means it's lacking one oxygen atom that RNA has. That's the difference. In each molecule, DNA is built up of a series of individual nucleotides, and it has the 4 bases, which we refer to as A, C, G, and T, which is the basis of the genetic code. The sequence at which these 4 alternatives are strung together is the way that the genetic information is encoded. RNA can do exactly the same thing, can take up similar structures and things, but it has this extra oxygen atom, and it has this extra oxygen atom at a particular point in the structure of the monomer that means that the polymeric chain of all these individual units is far less stable. So this extra oxygen atom can attack the adjacent phosphorus and lead to the breaking of the chain. So RNA is far less stable than DNA, but it's also much more interesting than DNA. DNA is boring.
Okay, tell us about that. Why is it interesting?
Watson and Crick sorted out DNA back in 1953. It's a double helix. And that's how the genetic information is, of course, propagated through the generations, is because each strand has that information. The strands can be separated and a second strand synthesized for each one. And so one copy becomes 2 copies. And that's the basis of inheritance, is that each copy goes. So that's DNA. Now, RNA can take up that structure too, but typically in the cell, it's found as a single strand. And in that single strand, it's not going to be extended, but it's going to fold up into complex structures and shapes. And when it does that, interesting things happen. So the workhorses for chemistry in the cell are the proteins, the enzymes, which are long chains of a different monomer called amino acids. And they fold up into individual structures. Each individual protein has a unique structure. And, you know, the proteins that do chemistry, which we refer to as enzymes, fold up in such a structure that they will bind reactants and cause those reactants to undergo chemistry. And so that's the basis of metabolism, you know, that you break down glucose, you get energy, because there's a whole series of enzymes that break down the glucose into component parts and ultimately liberate energy. So RNA has the characteristics of proteins in terms of it folds up in unique structures that are determined by that individual sequence of A, C, Gs, and Ts. Well, in RNA, they're called U rather than T, but that's a minor difference. So the unique primary sequence determines the structure. And you can get a wide range of different structures. And what I've been studying mostly are what we refer to as ribozymes. And that name is derived from enzyme. Enzymes are protein that do chemistry, and ribozymes are RNA that bind reactants and do chemistry. When they were first discovered in the 80s, they were of sort of interest, sort of because of their novelty. But subsequently, they've been interested because some of the most important reactions in the cell are performed by ribozymes rather than enzymes. The most famous is the ribosome, which is the factory within the cell that reads the genetic information and makes the proteins. That's actually composed of a complex mixture of RNA and proteins itself, but it is the RNA elements in the ribosome that actually do the chemistry of stitching together the amino acids to become proteins. So that's the work I've been mostly doing. And there's another reason, of course, why ribozymes have been of interest, and that's because of the origin of life. Where the best explanation we have for how life got going is called the Rna World Hypothesis, which I suspect you haven't heard of. But essentially, you see, there's this chicken and egg problem in molecular biology, because the DNA is the genetic information, and that genetic information, and this is a gross simplification, of course, but the DNA contains the genetic information in its sequence and nucleotides, and that sequence encodes how to make proteins. But how do you read that sequence? The answer is a protein comes along and opens out the DNA and makes a copy of that sequence, and it makes it in RNA. And then that RNA is transported elsewhere in the cell, and that sequence is read by proteins. And this ribosome makes the sequence, makes the protein. And that is, as I said, a mixture of RNA and protein. So you rely on all these different proteins to read the sequence in the DNA. How did the whole thing get going? The way of breaking that circle is the RNA, because the RNA protein DNA is a store of genetic information, and it's very good at that because it's very stable. But RNA can store that same sequence. It's just not as good at it because it's less stable. Proteins do the chemistry, but they rely on the the DNA, to encode the sequence for how to make the protein. Proteins do chemistry very well. On the whole, proteins do it much better than RNA, but RNA can do the chemistry. So that's the hypothesis of how the world got started, is through RNA being both the store of genetic information and doing the chemistry. And very quickly afterwards, it's thought it rapidly was supplanted by, or elaborated, shall we say, by DNA and protein coming into being. But it's thought that it got started with RNA, or maybe a mixture of RNA and protein. But the key thing is that the RNA was doing both things. It was doing the chemistry and storing the information. And I've been doing some work recently on a hypothesis we've got of certain RNA molecules that exist today that may have evolved from those very, very early ribozymes that would have been involved in the very earliest forms of life. So,
I mean, like, Dundee has got a couple of, I think, Nobel Prize winner from life sciences. What are the chances you guys will get also Nobel Prize? Now, at one morning, you'll get a knock in your door and say that Dr. Tim Wilson. you got the Nobel Prize for.
Oh, zero. There's no chance at all. Seriously, the work I've been doing is not
I know
interesting
scientists are
enough.
very humble. Scientists
Yeah,
are
no,
humble.
the work I've been doing is interesting to a small group of scientists throughout the world, but it doesn't have the potential to capture the world headlines that is needed to earn yourself a Nobel Prize. I mentioned that the ribosomes were shown to be ribozymes about 20 years ago. Well, that because ribosomes are just central to evolution and current biology. It's arguably the most important reaction in the cell, stitching together proteins. Because that's so central, that work did win the Nobel Prize. And one of the winners was Venki Ramakrishnan from who's president of the ex-president of the Royal Society now and things, and because he was one of the lead workers in that work. But yeah, no, the stuff I've been doing is it's good, solid science, I think, but it's not going to have quite the same impact.
So, like in terms of obviously, the world has been facing this COVID thing for more than a year now. Did it affect your research positively or negatively?
Well, negatively, in as much as we were locked out of the laboratory for a while, along with everyone else in the university, and we've also had funding problems subsequently because we've been funded. Our laboratory's been funded by for 20 years or more by Cancer Research UK, and they've had to reduce their funding dramatically, and so we've only got funding now until the middle of next year, and I really don't think there's any chance of picking up additional funding from Cancer Research. So we're currently looking for alternative sources of funding to keep the research going. And you can never be certain you're going to get your
next funding.
Your next funding, we can never be certain our Cancer Research Program grant would be renewed. But I felt that our most recent submission was stronger than the previous one, and I felt we had a fair chance of getting funded. But there's no doubt that, the pandemic's pulled the rug from under us. We were always on the edge of cancer research funding anyway, because what our laboratory does is essentially pure research, understanding systems that may lead to, because the work we do is involved in understanding gene expression and understanding in other aspects of the work in the lab, understanding the repair of nucleic acids that go on inside the cell. So they're intimately related to cancer in the concept that cancer is essentially the inappropriate expression of the genetic information within a cell. But we're providing, if you like, the fundamental information that may lead to the development of a target. We're certainly not focusing on, let's find a cure for cancer in these particular cells, So, you're always at the sort of that element of cancer research funding that could be first cut if there's a funding crisis. You know, yeah, obviously the last thing they're going to cut will be the funding they're putting into existing trials for drugs and things, and rightly so. So we were always somewhat tenuous in our justification for funding from cancer research. So it was pretty obvious they were going to pull the plug on us when their income suddenly dropped by 2/3. So yeah, so it's had a big impact from that point of view. But with a bit of luck, one of the grants that pending will get funded and we'll keep going.
Because like with your kind of research, I mean, that can also solve pandemic as well, the future pandemic from this planet. I mean, if you know.
Well, not what we're doing in our lab, but you know, there's all sorts of relationships. You know, coronaviruses are RNA viruses. Understanding how cells deal with RNA can lead to unanticipated events and results. And certainly, you know, the great new vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna are RNA-based vaccines, which is it's an idea that's been banging around for a decade, but yeah, it's amazing to see it come to fruition. You know, those ideas are directly transferable from vaccines to the treatment of cancer, for instance. In the idea that you get a piece of RNA into the cell and you get expression of a protein from that. And what the vaccines are doing is they're taking this spike protein from the surface of the virus, using the RNA sequence that produces that protein, getting it into the cell so that the cell produces this spike protein and then spits it out into the bloodstream so that the immune system recognizes this foreign protein and raises antibodies to it. Same approach can be used for treating cancer, in theory, that you get the RNA into a cell and express a protein that will, in some way, act to suppress the growth of the cancer. And because cancer is not one disease, but a multitude of different diseases, each different cell that becomes cancerous has a different underlying biology. So there's no such thing as a cure for cancer, only a cure for a particular type of cancer. But the general concept of getting the RNA into the cell and expressing a protein is a very exciting one for treating cancer. And it's clear from these vaccines that they've overcome a huge hurdle in getting the RNA into the cell, which was always one of the big barriers. So, you know, I think the same technology that's giving us these RNA vaccines has a lot of promise in treating a lot of different diseases, such as cancer and also perhaps genetic diseases, you know, some horrible genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis that might ultimately be able to be treatable in this sort of way.
Just a quick question around this cancer thing. I mean, do you think more and more people are dying from cancer? Is the numbers getting bigger every year?
Well, you know, see, cancer is just a genetic lottery. You know, every time a cell divides, there's a certain chance that a mutation will occur. And most of them are benign, but some of those mutations are harmful. And if enough of the wrong mutations occur, you get a cancerous cell. This is inevitable. So if we stay alive and nothing else gets us first, like a bullet or a heart disease or smoking, etc. You know, if nothing else gets us, cancer will carry us off eventually. That's an absolute inevitability. So if more and more people are dying of cancer, maybe it's just a reflection of the increased life expectancy. So we've eliminated a lot of the other ways we find of killing ourselves, like drinking polluted water, which used to be a very common way of dying, you know, 200 years ago. Well, we pretty well got rid of that one in much of the world. And, you know, life expectancy is keeping on growing, except when the Tories destroy the health system. But that's a short-term phenomenon. A longer-term life expectancy has been growing pretty consistently for several centuries, you know, and that's reflecting so many health benefits of different types, of which undoubtedly clean water and sewerage was by far the most important. Far more important than anything else.
But
you know, but yeah, all these different medical interventions we have now extend our life, yes, and so if we get rid of all the rest, the cancer will get us eventually.
I mean, another like kind of like my kind of question. I mean, like I'll always, because I'm involved in like decolonizing curriculum and all those things, but two of the Western guys I really, really, you know, admire is Darwin and Freud. How much Darwin is respected in your field?
Oh, Darwin is definitely regarded as one of the greats. He's up on the first level. You know, when you're talking about great scientists, he's right up in the top tier of the Parthenon. Because you know, he just totally overturned. He challenged an orthodoxy. The idea of natural selection, you know, is simple, and from our perspective now is obvious. You know, I think it was Aldous Huxley, one of the Huxleys anyway, famously said at the time, you know, why didn't I think of that? That was basically his review of Darwin, you know. But the point is, someone had to think of it, and he knew that what he was proposing was essentially, in the Western context at least, that men descended from animals rather than being a gift from God. You know, this was a challenge to so much of society. And he took years to get all the evidence together to back it up. So you know, I think having apart from the quality of the evidence, is just having the courage to challenge the religious dogma of the day. You know, so it's just, you know, an impressive feat.
I mean, I was reading some stuff by, I'm not sure whether you heard about someone called Yuval Harari. So he's an Israeli historian.
Yes.
Sapiens.
Read Sapiens. He wrote, I've read Sapiens. It's on my bookshelf. So good. Fantastic book.
Because I mean, he was, I think in his, like one of his books, I mean, he was saying that, I mean, Homo sapiens are hardwired with post-truth. So basically, you know, they love those, you know, fictional thing. So like, you know, if billions of people believe in a fiction, that's actually religion.
Yes, absolutely. I think he's absolutely right. It's all about stories. You know, I think humans have been telling stories ever since we were humans. That's how we learn about the world, and science is just a different story. It's a different way of telling a story. But yeah, no, I think his analysis has got an awful lot to be said for it. I'm not sure how much of it is original by him, but he certainly has, in Sapiens, he certainly put together and shown this way of thinking about the world very effectively. It's a very well-written book that communicates the ideas extremely well, I find.
Do you think like scientists are not good with telling a story?
Wow, I think that's a generalization you really shouldn't make. I can think of scientists who are absolutely appalling at telling a story. But others are wonderful communicators.
Because I mean,
now, I'm not going to name names there, but
I mean, if you believe like Harari's thesis that no, Homo sapiens are hardwired with fiction or like imagination, so perhaps scientists have to tell stories more.
Well, I think there are cases where the story has been very good. Darwin's a great example, I think, that the story of natural selection, it's a great way of communicating that idea. And there are some aspects of science that are much easier to tell a story than others. And to some extent, perhaps they help capture the imagination. The story of evolution is told far more effectively when you've got a T-Rex on board. I'm serious. In terms of
I mean, like Hollywood did hundreds of films on T-Rex.
Yeah, but it's photogenic idea, isn't it? This massive lizard, But kids love dinosaurs. They always have, ever since ever since they knew about the idea. Something about dinosaurs capture the imagination. So, communicating the history of life on Earth and evolution, you put a T-Rex into it, you've got the story.
And then people will believe it,
Well, some won't, because there's this other story about religion you mentioned earlier that sort of clashes a little bit, doesn't it? Especially in some parts of the world more than others. But it's just so much of the history of the world can be viewed in terms of competing stories and what stories get believed and get promoted. And so what you've been working on yourself, the history of the world, at least as seen through Western eyes, up until very recently, has been, I think, strongly influenced by Darwin. The survival of the fittest idea. Well, the Western population came to dominate the world around the time that Darwin's ideas came fashionable. And so there was this idea that, well, therefore Western man is dominant, they're superior, fittest. And license, here we go for full-blooded racism. That was the dominant story in the 19th century in Western world, that Western man was superior and nothing else could be believed. And it's really only been probably post-Second World War and the colonial era that this idea has been challenged within the Western world to any great degree. I'm sure it always existed in other parts
Yeah.
of the world. But, you know, so from my cultural point of view, Australia, back before I was born, in the 50s, etc., you know, it had a white Australia policy. We didn't want to let anyone else in because they were inferior. You know, Australia's a hell of a lot nicer place now than back then, I'm sure. But yeah, that's the history of, you know, that story of white supremacy has gradually been supplanted by other stories over the course of my lifetime. And, you know, that's a combination of, I think there's scientific story there saying, well, basically there's no evidence for white supremacy. But there's also been other stories to do with human rights, for instance, also working against this idea of white supremacy. So you can view much of history as competing stories. You know.
Like, I mean, one of my memorable moment in Australia was watching Olympic, 2000 Sydney Olympic.
Oh yeah.
And Kathy Freeman was running for the, you know, sprint.
Yeah.
And she actually won, I think, 2 gold or 3 gold. I mean, yeah. And I always thought that, you know, sports is always good in terms of uniting humanity. It's really special, that moment.
Yeah, it's a nice thought. It doesn't seem to last.
No.
See, it's in the case of Australia, I can't help thinking that someone like Kathy Freeman almost becomes an honorary white, and her Aboriginal heritage can just get sort of pushed aside. You know, we'll embrace her wonderful achievement and feel good about it. It won't actually lead us to do anything to address the problems in the Aboriginal community to any degree, you know. Maybe that's a horribly cynical attitude, but I think when John Howard and his ilk are Prime Minister, I'm allowed to be cynical. I'm sorry.
Because I was watching recent Wimbledon, so I'm a like tennis fan. So like when like Angie Barty was winning the, you know, women's final, because she was wearing this like scallop dress to, you know, remember the first Aboriginal who actually won Wimbledon, I think 1970s. So she brought this very powerful story. But again, like, you know, this is not like, you know, widely spread story. Story is very, I don't know, it's very kind of not much publicized. But I was doing a bit of research on this, and I found, oh my God, this girl is amazing, you know, very young woman, and then, you know, brought this very powerful message. And we missed that opportunity to, you know, to highlight those things. I mean,
yeah, I wonder what sort of coverage that got in Australia. I don't know.
I don't know. And I was really surprised, you know, the way the audience also behaved. I might have been biased because audience was not supporting her at all in the final. I thought she's an amazing sports person.
Well, I have no idea about who got support in the final and things, and on the history of the 2 players, but yeah, crowds will generally go for the underdog.
Yeah, that could be, yeah.
And the other lass was definitely the underdog.
The message she brought, I think that was very powerful, very, very powerful. But I think we should have promoted that story, you know, and then the new generation could have learned so many things from his story.
Yeah, you know the story of Yvonne Goolagong, who's now calling, you know, who won Wimbledon back in 1970. You know, she was Aboriginal, but she was one of the Aboriginals that were removed from her mother and brought up in a white family. So there's another example of a sort of almost honorary white, and that whole history of the stolen generations of Aboriginals.
Because I mean, it was.
Have you seen the film? Have you seen the film Rabbit Proof Fence?
I heard about it. Not yet. I will.
I've got the DVD somewhere. It's a great film. So Rabbit Proof Fence tells the story of these young girls who escaped from a mission, a religious mission where these young girls have been separated from their family and they escape and try to return to it and things. It's a great film, and it's apparently essentially a true story. I've got the DVD. I'll give it to you. Strongly recommend it.
I mean, with me, like personally, I'm a very emotional person. Even like there are lots of films made on like things like Rwanda's genocide. I struggle to watch these films. Really struggle. I don't know. So like,
I'm the same to some extent. I would not choose to watch a film on the Rwandan genocide. That's just too horrible.
No, even like I still remember the TV series like Roots when I was growing up. It's so traumatic to watch. But my dad forced me to watch some of the episodes. I mean,
well, yeah. I mean, you don't want to. You can't ignore these things, can you?
Yeah.
It's important that the story is told. Even if it is traumatic, but there's a time and a place, isn't there? Rabbit Proof Fence is.
I'll try.
Has a good balance between being uplifting and being depressing, shall we say?
Okay. we have talked quite a bit. I mean, because obviously, the science is one of those subject area. Like everyone. We don't see like lots of people are coming to the science field. I mean, and then we rely on lots of, overseas students to, cover science thing. I mean, what's the catch there? I mean, why science is not picking up, big way, like, popular subject area?
Well, I mean, there's plenty of people doing it. But it's undoubtedly the case that there's a large international community doing science in the UK. You can look on that on a positive spin. Basically, the UK is capable of attracting the best in the world because of the quality of its infrastructure and the history of its scientific performance. I couldn't comment on whether enough British kids are doing science and getting the proper education, etc. I'm inclined to think British education leaves a fair bit to be desired in a number of areas, but I don't think I really have despite having watched two kids go through the mill myself, I don't think I've really got the breadth of view to judge.
I mean, like one of the political question here is the flip side of that story is countries like America, especially the Western world, the way they attract those best of the other, that creates problems for the other.
Yes, and Australia is a great example of that. The brain drain. Very many bright Australians do what I've done and move overseas and basically don't return. And I know that's the case throughout the world, that top people get attracted to places like the UK and America because they've got the funding, etc., to do the work. I think there's no easy answer to that sort of problem. I really don't have one. Australia's been trying to solve that problem ever since Australia existed, and they haven't come up with a solution. You know, it's pretty easy to find Australians, especially in the UK, working in the higher education sector. There's no shortage of them. Yeah, I think you can argue to some degree, in some areas of science, it doesn't matter where the work's done. The important thing is that the work is done. In other areas, it's really important that the work gets transferred back. So, for instance, I have a friend works in James Hutton Institute. Although I think he might have retired now because the pandemic might have just finished his work off. He was about a year from retiring anyway. I haven't seen him for since about September or something. But you know, his research was essentially on potato crops, and he did a lot of work, a lot of visits to South America and Asia. Yeah, so there, I think it doesn't matter where the work's done as long as the knowledge is transferred back and transferred throughout the world. And so, you know, it's important that work is done in the best places, you know, that you get good minds together to progress it. And the UK certainly historically is one of those places. We might wind the clock forward 100 years, maybe all the good work's going to be done in China. Who knows?
Yeah.
But China does have its cultural problems, though, in terms of, from what I've heard of it, and up until recently, pre-pandemic, we had a number of Chinese postdocs in our lab. They've all gone home courtesy of COVID. But it sounds like science there is a bit more regimented. Young scientists don't get quite as much freedom to explore new ideas, have to give a bit more deference to the senior professor, etc. That's probably an excellent way of doing routine science, but not necessarily the best way of getting a startling new insight, a startling breakthrough, you know.
Because we also write journal article or this kind of stuff, but whenever we see like science article, it's written by like 10 people, 12 people.
Often, yes. Yes.
And then do you think that kind of like doesn't help those young scientists coming out with new ideas and that?
Well, it depends. You see, as in any field, there's a unwritten code, you know, about what that list of authors mean, as to who's actually done the work, etc. And in recent years, there's become a much stronger view that the work should be explicitly acknowledged. There are journals that say, no, we don't do that, but there are plenty of journals these days who either encourage or insist on, as part of the paper, saying TJW and DMJL designed the research and this person did that work and this person did that work, you know, and so you actually see the input from the various authors. So that there's a greater acknowledgement of who did what. And there was also one reason for doing that is because there has been a tendency over the years for, shall we say, honorary authorships. So like, I understand it was often the practice in, say, French research institutes. The director of the institute got his name on every paper, regardless of whether he had any idea what the work was about. The contribution to the working environment, you know, you could justify it from that point of view, but these days the view is much more that the only people who should be on the paper are the people who directly made an intellectual contribution to that work. So,
I mean, like,
you know, I've published papers where it's basically been a year's solid work to get that paper out. And I've published other papers where it's been, my contribution has been, you know, a couple of weeks' work. And I've also once or twice got my name on a paper from the laboratory because I asked some nasty questions in meetings, which, you know, an intellectual contribution nonetheless, you know, that, you know, my viewpoint advanced the work. Is a polite way of putting it, that, you know, by asking some insightful questions and dreaming up ideas, you know, I made an intellectual contribution, even though I really did not do any of the work at all. But if you make a strong enough contribution like that, I think it's fair enough you get an acknowledgement. You know, so some papers are obviously worth much more than others from the point of view of your own input.
Definitely. But I think that's the modern world. I mean, the way things are, lots of things are getting standardized, you know, like, I mean, used to done by one. Now it looks like, you know, things are done by a team of people and the whole team. I was listening to this like song, do you know, this like pop star, you know, young guy. So it's like my daughter was listening and I thought, oh my God, that's really good tune. I mean, so the song was by Harry Styles and the song is called The Signs of the Time or Sign of the Times. It's really, really, you know, kind of very powerful lyrics. And then I tried to find out that who actually wrote this song. And then I found that song was written by 6 people. Song was written by 6 people. I mean, so if you remember like the Bob Dylan, you know, like 60s, 70s, all those songs, you know, like this is written by just one person, the poet, you know, but it looks like, you know, you can, 6 people write a song. I mean, how does it work?
Well, fine, you know, if that's how it goes, that's how it goes, you know.
So I think that's the future. That's the future. It looks like.
But that's much more the case in the music world these days. Is you know, people sampling from other people and mixing and matching and blending and things. You know, in principle, there's nothing wrong with that in my mind.
No.
You know, obviously there's commercial questions involved, but from an artistic point of view, artists have always robbed other people's ideas and built on past artists. That's the way it works, isn't it? I mean, anyone who's a budding artist is going to be influenced by the art they've seen around them. There's nothing wrong with that.
No. But you can see that how the things changed over the years, over the centuries.
Yeah.
Like we used to read, like, you know, Shakespeare's and all those like sonnets. You know, now we'll read sonnets by 6 people, written by 6 people, one sonnet.
Yeah.
So we'll not see like John Keats. No, like we'll see like 6 people or 7 people.
They'll need to dream up a catchy acronym if they want to get in the history books, I think. You'll need 1 or 2 authors with a vowel as their first letter, you know, so you can make a catchy name.
Okay, like I will ask like 1 or 2 last questions. One question is like, what will be your advice for the future, you know, students who are coming to this, you know, science field, who will be the, you know, full-time researcher?
Oh gosh, that is a tough question. back in New Hampshire, a friend of mine told me she'd just enrolled in a PhD. And I said, I won't give you a name. I said, look, you got a lovely family, a lovely house, a good job. Why throw it all away? And I was semi-serious. I can't help thinking that the problem with science as a career is there's a small number of really good jobs and quite a large number of pretty crap jobs in science. You know, if you've got the talent to get a certain way up and you get to be doing your own research and you enjoy the intellectual side of it, that's great. But there's an awful lot of mundane jobs, technicians, etc., which, yeah, aren't very rewarding if you're a clever person. So, I do wonder whether what the future is for a lot of the students who go through the mill of getting a science degree. There's certainly plenty of decent jobs out there. You know, if you become a science teacher, if you've got the aptitude for teaching, it can be a wonderfully rewarding job, for instance. But yeah, I think there's a lot of routine jobs in science that I personally wouldn't want to do. I'd get bored very quickly. So, you know, my thinking about advising young people to do science is you really want to think about where you're wanting to go with your career. Anyone who is good enough to do a science degree has almost certainly got other options too. And you need to think about whether you're interested in doing academia or whether you're heading to business, etc., and reflect on that as you're doing it and what your goals are, because the choices that you make in what you choose to study and things can be very constraining, and I feel that's particularly true in the life sciences. My son is just going off to do physics.
Yeah.
Most of the physicists end up in the city these days, I believe, because they're good with numbers. They work out interest rates or something, dream up wonderful schemes for dodging taxes and things.
Because they're good in math. So.
Well, yeah, they got sharp minds. That I can see their skills can be transferred. Whether it's good for society, I'm not so sure.
So one very last question. If you are allowed to, this is special gift, dead or alive, to have a dinner with like 3 people, which 3 people?
3 people.
Dead or alive?
Which 3 people? Oh, gosh.
Please, Darwin. One of them is Darwin. No, you can decide whatever you want to do.
Oh, you should have given me warning of this question. Oh, gosh, 3 people.
It just came to my mind now. You don't have to be politically correct. It can be anyone, anything.
Well, I'll tell you, one person I would like to meet would have been James Cook. Because he's an interesting character. He came from a poor background, not like most of the Royal Navy's admirals and things who were. He came from a poor northern background, and he was a strict disciplinarian, I gather. But he introduced the use of breadfruit and things and cabbage to stop vitamin C, to ensure the men got vitamin C, so they stopped scurvy and things. That's one of the reasons his cruises were so successful. And they also did quite some interesting science and things. So James Cook would be a very interesting person to get to know. But my tastes are rather broad. Another person I would love to meet would be Beethoven.
Okay.
Because I love his music. I love his music, and he's again got an interesting story in his life.
Amazing story, yeah.
So there's two.
You are not a sports person. I'm just giving you some random clue, you know.
Yeah. I enjoy sports, but I don't idolize sports. So I can't immediately think of any sportsman or woman who would get into my top three.
Number three.
Number three. Let's go for a political figure, maybe. Actually, no, I'm going to go for a different one. Are you frozen again? No.
No.
Right. I would like to have a chat with Robert Oppenheimer.
Okay.
Father of the bomb. Because unlike some of the scientists involved here, he was aware of the moral implications of what he was doing. And I think that would be an interesting discussion.
Do you think he would be furious about things going on?
I don't know about furious, but I honestly don't know what he'd be thinking. Yes, but that would be why it'd be interesting to talk to him, to see his view on what's happened post 1945, how the world's developed, etc. So there's three people. I'm sure I could think of plenty more.
Thank you. Because this is an unexpected question, but I thought, the way you thought, so I gave you time. So I think it's good, very good, very, powerful as well. But Dr. Tim Wilson, absolute pleasure today.
Had fun. I'm going to go over to the other side of the room and dig out that DVD now before I forget, because I'm getting a bit more forgetful these days.
Thank you, Tim.
Great. Thanks, Abdullah.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Speak soon. Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.